Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.
In the shadowy lower levels of Krevtar, the sprawling port city of Varela 9, David Rourke crouched in a service corridor, watching the steady stream of buyers filing toward the trade hall. His calloused fingers made quick work of a security panel, bypassing the checkpoint protocols with practiced ease. 6 years as a smuggler had taught him more than just cargo routes. "Identification required for sector access," droned an automated voice from the panel. David pulled a thin metal chip from his boot and slid it into the reader. "Medical supply delivery for trading post administration," he muttered, the rehearsed lie rolling easily off his tongue. The panel blinked green. "Proceed, service personnel." He pocketed the chip, purchased at exorbitant cost from a forger in the spaceport slums, and slipped through the maintenance door. The service corridors were a maze of pipes and conduits, but he navigated them with the confidence of someone who had studied the layout meticulously. This wasn't impulsive. He'd been planning this infiltration for weeks. As he moved through the cramped passages, a memory flashed unbidden across his mind. A marine extraction gone wrong on Helios 4. Slaves in neural collars, eyes desperate with hope as his unit arrived. Then the slaver's dead man switch, the collars activating, 27 beings dropping lifeless to the ground before he could reach them. Their bodies still haunted him, the way they fell, like puppets with cut strings. Another memory surfaced alongside it, Captain Reeves shoving him aside during the Orion incursion, taking a plasma bolt meant for David. The captain's last words as he bled out, "Make it count, Rourke." He'd resigned his commission the day after Helios 4, feeling he'd failed both the slaves and his captain's sacrifice. David pushed the memories away and focused on the task ahead. The access panel to the trade hall was just ahead. The trade hall on Varela 9 roared with voices that echoed off the ancient stone walls. Hundreds of species from across the galaxy, speaking dozens of dialects, all blending into a cacophony of greed and desperation. The air was thick with the stench of too many bodies pressed together in the humid atmosphere, tinged with the sweet chemical smell of intoxicants and the metallic tang of fear. Overhead, holographic displays flickered with transaction records and buyer credentials, casting an eerie blue glow across the sea of aliens. David slipped into the back of the crowd, pulling a threadbare hood over his head. Humans were rare enough here to draw attention, and the last thing he needed was recognition. He moved to a shadowed alcove that offered a clear view of the proceedings while keeping him partially concealed. Near the front of the hall, a raised platform housed the VIP section where the wealthy and powerful lounged on hover cushions, sipping exotic beverages served by attendant droids. A portly Altharian minister, his scaled skin oiled to a nauseating shine, laughed uproariously as he placed a bid on a trembling Pax Thorn laborer. Beside him, a female diplomat from the Central Alliance, supposedly dedicated to sentient rights, discreetly authorized a transaction through her neural implant, her eyes cold and calculating. On the stage at the front stood the cages, transparent force field cubes that hum with barely contained energy. Inside them, the merchandise, sentient beings reduced to property. Most were broken, their spirits crushed by captivity, their eyes vacant and shoulders slumped in defeat. Except her. Zahira, the last of the Azure-born, stood tall despite the neural chains that bound her wrists and ankles. Her sapphire skin shimmered beneath the harsh lights, seeming to absorb and then reflect the illumination in mesmerizing patterns. Her amber eyes, vertical pupils dilated in the brightness, burned with a defiance that sent shivers through the crowd. Her long silver hair was matted and tangled, but still caught the light like polished metal. The microfiber prison garment they'd forced her into couldn't hide the natural grace of her movements as she shifted her weight, refusing to bow her head even as the auctioneer described her like livestock. David's breath caught in his throat. He'd heard rumors of the Azure-born, warriors of legendary skill whose entire civilization had been systematically eradicated when they refused to become weapons for the galactic powers. As he watched her, he noticed a faint pattern of ritual scarring along her forearms, clan markings, he guessed, though he couldn't read their significance. Around her left wrist, barely visible beneath the neural chain, was a slender band of what looked like woven metal, inlaid with luminescent stones that pulsed with a faint, hypnotic rhythm. The crowd remained silent when bidding opened. "Too dangerous," their silence said. "Too proud. She'll kill you in your sleep." The Azureborn were legendary warriors, their genetic makeup allowing them strength and reflexes that outmatched nearly any other species. Their homeworld had been destroyed in the colonial wars, their people scattered and hunted to extinction for their combat abilities. Now, apparently, only one remained. "Come now," the auctioneer, a bloated Krell named Jaruk, cajoled the crowd, his translucent skin flushing orange with frustration. The folds of his neck quivered as he spoke, his six-fingered hands gesturing expansively. "She's the last of her kind. A collector's item. Think of the status, the prestige." Still no one bid. Zahira's eyes swept the crowd, her contempt palpable. As David watched her, something inside him shifted, a decision crystallizing like a formation of ice. His hand moved to his chest, where beneath his jumpsuit hung his old Marine tags, the last remnant of a life abandoned. He'd kept them as a reminder of his failure on Helios 4. Perhaps now they could serve a different purpose. He stepped forward, pushing through the press of bodies. The movement caught the attention of a security guard, a muscular Drazarian with reinforced exoskeletal plating. The guard's eyes widened in recognition. "Rourke?" he muttered, disbelief evident in his flanged voice. "That you?" David froze, then slowly turned. Maddox. They'd served together in the 103rd Marine Division before David's desertion, before Helios 4. "Walk away, Maddox," David said quietly. "This isn't your business." The Drazarian's compound eyes flickered to the exit, then back to David. "There's a bounty on you, you know. Enough to retire on." "I know." A tense moment passed between them, years of shared history hanging in the balance. "I never saw you," Maddox finally said, stepping back into the shadows. "But you're a fool to be here. And this makes us even for Proxima Centauri." David nodded once in acknowledgement, then continued toward the stage. He was tall for his species, with broad shoulders and the hard, lean look of someone who lived on the edge of survival. His dark hair was cropped short, and a jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, bisecting an otherwise symmetrical face. His clothing was worn but serviceable, the utilitarian jumpsuit of a cargo hauler, with empty pockets turned inside out, a universal signal of broke status. "I'll bid," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. It was a strong voice, one that had given orders and expected them to be followed. Jarek turned, his bulbous eyes widening in surprise before narrowing in amusement. His translator unit buzzed as it converted his wet, gurgling language into galactic standard. "You," he laughed, the sound like rocks in a garbage disposal. "With pockets turned inside out? What's your offer, scavenger?" David stepped closer to the stage, and Zahira's gaze fixed on him with sudden intensity. There was something in the way he moved, efficient, purposeful, aware of his surroundings in a way that spoke of military training. His eyes met hers across the distance, steady and unflinching. "I'll bid," he repeated, louder this time. Jarek's skin rippled with mocking laughter. "And what could you possibly offer that would interest me, human?" David kept his eyes locked with Zahira's. In that moment, something passed between them, an unspoken understanding that neither could have articulated. He had nothing left to trade, nothing but himself. "I offer my life," he said, his voice echoing in the sudden silence that fell over the hall, "as bond to her freedom." The collective intake of breath from hundreds of beings created a strange vacuum of sound. Zahira's amber eyes widened slightly, the first real emotion she'd shown besides defiance. "That's not currency," Kuruk sneered, his translator struggling to convey his contempt. "It is if someone wants me dead," David replied, his tone matter-of-fact. "I have enemies, high-paying ones. The Syndicate has a bounty on me that would buy your entire inventory." Jarek's skin flushed a deeper orange as he considered this. Bounties were indeed a recognized currency in the outer systems, and if this human was wanted by the Syndicate... An elderly Vexian merchant near the front raised a gnarled appendage. "He invokes the Thalkir," the being announced, its voice crackling with age. "The life bond exchange. By interstellar commercial law, Section 47, Paragraph 9, such an offer must be considered if the value can be verified." Murmurs swept through the crowd. The Thalkir was an ancient practice, rarely invoked in modern times but still recognized in the trading codes that govern commerce in the lawless outer systems. A life freely offered for another's freedom, a sacred exchange, bound by tradition older than most of the species present. Zahira stepped forward in her cage, the neural chains sparking and warning at the sudden movement. "You don't know me," she said, her voice melodious despite the edge of suspicion. "Why risk your life?" David shrugged, a simple human gesture that somehow contained volumes. "I don't know cowards either, but I know what slavery looks like. I've seen enough." From her vantage point, Zahira studied the human intently. She had seen his kind before, do-gooders who thought heroics could wash away their guilt. They never lasted. Yet something in his eyes gave her pause, not pity or lust, but a clear, steady conviction that reminded her of her own people. Before they fell. For a moment, her mind flashed back to the last day on Azarath, the orbital bombardment turning the crystalline spires of her ancestral home to dust. Her clan elders forming a defensive ring around the evacuation ships, buying time with their lives. She had been the youngest warrior adept, ordered to escort the children to safety. The ship had been captured anyway, the children sold to labor colonies. Zahira herself passed from one collector to another until she ended up here. The memory burned like acid, and then, like a shadow across her thoughts, another memory surfaced, fragments of overheard conversation during her first captivity. Marine Strike Forces, Operation Cleansing Light. The humans had been there supporting the Syndicate's pacification of Azurath. Her fingers tightened imperceptibly on the neural chains. How many humans had participated in her world's destruction? Could this one, with his scarred face and haunted eyes, have been among them? Jarek's translucent fingers tapped against his control panel as he accessed the bounty database. His eyes widened and his skin flushed a deep red. Excitement. Greed. "Interesting," he gurgled. "Very interesting indeed." He raised his voice to address the confused crowd. "We have an unusual situation. Legal precedent must be consulted. This auction is temporarily suspended." The crowd erupted in protest, but security drones descended from the ceiling, their weapons primed. The message was clear. The auction was over, at least for now. "Take them both to holding cell 3, Jarok ordered his guards. "Claim legal ambiguity." The holding cell was small and stark, with only a single light panel embedded in the ceiling and a waste disposal unit in the corner. The walls were made of some kind of polymer that felt slightly warm to the touch, as if it were alive. There was no obvious door. They had been phased through the wall by the guard's transport technology. Zahira paced the small space like a caged predator. Her chains removed, but her rage undiminished. Her silver hair swung with each sharp turn, and her amber eyes occasionally caught the light, seeming to glow from within. With each circuit of the cell, she unconsciously touched the woven metal band on her wrist, a habit born of years of captivity, when that bracelet had been her only connection to her lost world. "I don't need saving," she snapped after nearly an hour of silence, whirling to face David, who sat with his back against the wall, watching her with those steady eyes. "Didn't say you did," he replied, his voice calm. "Just didn't want to watch it happen," she scoffed, resuming her pacing. "So you're what passes for a hero in human culture? Throwing your life away for strangers?" "No hero," David said, a hint of bitterness creeping into his voice. "Just a man who's seen too much to stand by anymore." He reached into his jumpsuit and withdrew a small, flat canteen. Unscrewing the cap, he took a careful sip, then offered it to her. Water, not poisoned. Zahira's eyes narrowed suspiciously, but her throat was dry. She took the canteen, sniffed it, then drank. "Your guard friend," she said, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "He'll betray you." David's eyebrows rose slightly. "You notice that?" "I notice everything," she replied flatly. "The Drazarian. You served together?" David nodded, impressed despite himself. 103rd Marine Division, before I deserted." "Why did you desert?" she asked, handing back the canteen. David was silent for a long moment, his fingers absently tracing the scar on his face. "Helios 4, he said finally. "Slave extraction mission. Everything went wrong. Dead man switch on the neural collars." His voice became clipped, mechanical. 27 dead before we could reach them. Just dropped, like they were nothing. He paused, his eyes distant. Before that, though, there was Operation Cleansing Light, supposed to be a peacekeeping mission. Turned into something else. Zahira went very still, her amber eyes fixed on him with sudden intensity. Operation Cleansing Light, she repeated. Her melodious voice suddenly flat. When was this? 5 years ago, David replied, noticing her reaction but misinterpreting it. Syndicate hired us as peacekeepers for a disputed sector. Turned out we were just muscle for a corporate takeover. I was young, following orders. His face darkened. By the time we realized what was happening, it was too late. Zahira's fingers tightened around the woven bracelet on her wrist. 5 years ago, the fall of Azeroth, the destruction of her people. And this human had been there. The Azure homeworld, she said, her voice dangerously soft. You were there. David's eyes widened in shock, realization dawning. That was Azeroth? They told us it was a pirate stronghold, a threat to galactic security. Horror spread across his features. We never saw civilians. They kept us in orbit, running blockade operations. Said the ground forces were handling evacuation. There was no evacuation, Zahira hissed, her entire body tensing like a predator about to strike. There was only slaughter. My people, my family, children. In a blur of motion, she was across the cell, her hand at David's throat, pinning him against the wall with inhuman strength. Her amber eyes blazed with 5 years of contained rage. Give me one reason I shouldn't kill you now, she demanded, her voice trembling with the effort of control. David didn't struggle. He met her gaze directly, his eyes filled with a pain that matched her own. I can't, he said simply. I wouldn't. For a long, tense moment, they remained frozen in that tableau, her hand at his throat, his life literally in her grasp. Then slowly her fingers loosened. You didn't know, she said, not a question, but a realization. You were used just as my people were. Yes, David replied hoarsely, but that doesn't absolve me. Nothing does. Zahira stepped back, her rage not diminished but redirected. The Syndicate, she said, and they orchestrated everything. The false intelligence, the pirate threat. They wanted our world's resources, and when we refused to sell, they took them by force. After Helios 4, I started asking questions, David said. Found documents, communications. That's why they want me dead. He looked at her with new understanding. That's why they want you contained. We're both witnesses to their crimes. Zahira's pacing resumed, but with a different energy now. Not the frustrated circling of a caged animal, but the purposeful stride of a predator planning its hunt. My people, she said, her voice low, were not conquered in battle. We were betrayed from within, sold piece by piece by those who valued wealth over honor. She held up her wrist where the metal band gleamed dully. This is all that remains of the House of Kirzalan, my clan, my family. As hours passed in the confines of the cell, the initial murderous tension between them gradually transformed into something else, a shared understanding of manipulation and loss. This human was not her enemy, Zahira realized. He was another weapon the Syndicate had used and discarded. When the automated food dispenser in the wall produced 2 packets of nutrient paste, he took one and offered her the other without comment. When she refused it, he simply set it aside within her reach and ate his own without complaint. You're strange, she said finally, after watching him for what felt like hours. The corner of his mouth quirked up. His even better than dangerous. Despite herself, Zahira smiled for the first time. A small, fleeting thing, but genuine. The expression transformed her face, softening the hard edges of her defiance into something unexpectedly beautiful. What's your real plan? She asked, sinking down to sit cross-legged near him, though still maintaining her distance. Nobody offers themselves as a bounty without an escape strategy. David raised an eyebrow. You overestimate me. I've got nothing left to lose, that's all. Everyone has something to lose, she countered. Not me, not anymore. His eyes took on a distant look, focused on memories she couldn't see. The Syndicate took care of that when they raided the colony on Helios. I was hauling cargo off-world when it happened. Came back to nothing. Zahira was silent for a long moment. I'm sorry, she said finally, the words awkward on her tongue as if she rarely offered sympathy. David shrugged. It's why I have a bounty. Took out half their leadership before they drove me off system. And now you're what? Suicidal? Practical, he corrected. My life for yours seemed like a fair trade. She studied him, head tilted slightly. You really believe I'll be free? Jarek won't honor that. No, David agreed, but at least it buys time. And time is opportunity, she finished, a warrior's axiom. He nodded, meeting her eyes. For the first time, Zahira truly looked at this human who had offered himself for hers. What she saw was not a hero, not a savior, but something perhaps more valuable. A survivor who understood what it meant to stand alone against a universe that wanted you broken or dead. And perhaps more significantly, someone who, like her, had been used as a weapon by the same enemy. The next night, as the trade center's artificial lighting dimmed to simulate darkness, Zahira was jolted from uneasy sleep by a subtle vibration in the cell wall. She was on her feet instantly, moving to David's side and shaking him awake with a hand over his mouth. His eyes snapped open, immediately alert, and he nodded once to show he understood. They pressed themselves against the wall beside where the entrance had been, waiting. The wall shimmered and three armed figures stepped through, weapons raised. The phase field closed behind them. Rourke, one of them called, the voice muffled by a tactical helmet. We know you're in here. Jarek sold your location. Come quietly and the alien doesn't have to die. David's eyes met Zahira's in the dimness. No words were necessary. They had both expected betrayal. The ambush came fast. Stun bolts pierced the darkness, illuminating the small cell with harsh blue light. The mercenaries shouted David's name, their voices distorted by their helmets' modulators. Zahira acted first, moving with the inhuman speed of her species. She disarmed one with her bare hands, twisting the weapon free and smashing it into the faceplate of his helmet. The reinforced polymer cracked, and the mercenary staggered back. David was only a heartbeat behind her, tackling the second mercenary around the waist and driving him into the wall. The third fired wildly, and Zahira pulled David into cover behind the fallen body of the first attacker. We need that phase control, David grunted, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead where a bolt had grazed him. Zahira nodded, her eyes scanning the mercenaries. The leader, she whispered. On his wrist! David grabbed the stunner from the fallen mercenary and fired a rapid burst at the third attacker, forcing him to duck. In that moment of distraction, Zahira launched herself across the cell, her body a blur of motion. She caught the leader's arm, twisting it with enough force that the sound of breaking bone was audible even over his scream. The phase control clattered to the floor, and David dove for it, rolling away from a wild shot. His fingers closed around the device, just as the third mercenary leveled his weapon at Zahira's back. Down, David shouted, and Zahira dropped instantly, the bolt passing over her head and striking the wall. David fired the stunner, catching the last mercenary in the chest. The man convulsed and collapsed. The control, Zahira urged, already stripping weapons and ammunition from the fallen attackers. David examined the Dewamam, a small cylindrical unit with a keypad. I don't know the codes. Zahira knelt beside the leader, who was clutching his broken arm and moaning. With clinical efficiency, she pressed her fingers to his throat, finding a pressure point that made his eyes bulge. The code, she said, her voice soft but deadly. Now. The mercenary gasped numbers, and David punched them in. The wall shimmered. They'll have alerted security, David said, gathering up the fallen weapons. We have minutes, maybe less. Zahira nodded, handing him a blaster. Then we move fast. They stepped through the phase field into a dimly lit corridor. Alarms began to wail, the sound piercing and insistent. This way, David said, his voice raised to be heard over the noise. He led them down the corridor, away from the main hall. You know this place? Zahira asked, keeping pace with him effortlessly. I've hauled cargo here before, he replied, checking around a corner before gesturing her forward. There's maintenance tunnels that run beneath the entire complex. They reached a service hatch, and David knelt to work the manual override. Zahira kept watch, her body tense and ready. Why did Jarok sell you out? She asked, her eyes scanning the corridor. David grunted as he forced the hatch open. Probably figured he'd get paid twice. Once for turning me in, once for whatever bounty he could still get for you. The hatch swung open, revealing a dark tunnel below. David lowered himself in first, then reached up to help Zahira. She ignored his hand, dropping silently beside him. The tunnel was cramped and dank, the air heavy with the smell of oil and recycled water. They moved as quickly as they could in the confined space, guided by the dim emergency lighting strips embedded in the floor. "We need to get off-world," David said as they navigated a junction. "I have contacts in the Outer Rim who might help." "Might?" Zahira echoed skeptically. David flashed her a grim smile. "Better odds than staying here." They emerged from the tunnels into a vast loading bay. Cargo containers were stacked in towering columns, creating a labyrinth of metal and shadow. The bay doors were open to the night, showing the sprawling cityscape of Varela 9 beyond, and further, the acidic marshes that surrounded the trading post. "There," David pointed to a small atmospheric shuttle near the edge of the bay. "If we can reach that—" His words were cut short by the sound of boots on metal. A squad of security drones rounded the corner of a cargo stack, their sensors immediately locking onto the fugitives. "Run!" David shouted, firing his blaster at the drones. The shots ricocheted off their armored shells, but created enough confusion for Zahira to sprint toward the shuttle. David followed, laying down covering fire. A bolt from one of the drones caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. He staggered but kept moving. They were halfway to the shuttle when the bay doors began to close, the massive metal panels sliding together with inexorable force. "We won't make it," Zahira said, her voice tight. David changed direction, pulling her toward a small maintenance vehicle. "This way." They reached the vehicle, a rugged transport designed for the harsh conditions of the marshes outside. David slammed his hand on the access panel, and the door hissed open. "Get in!" Zahira vaulted into the passenger seat while David took the controls. The engine roared to life, and David gunned it toward the narrowing gap in the bay doors. "This is insane," Zahira said, her eyes fixed on the closing doors. "Yep," David agreed, pushing the transport to its maximum speed. They shot through the gap with inches to spare, the scrape of metal on metal sending sparks flying as they emerged into the night air of Varela 9. The transport bounced over the rough terrain at the edge of the trading post, heading toward the acidic marshes that stretched to the horizon. Behind them, alarm klaxons blared and searchlights swept the darkness. "They'll follow," Zahira said, looking back at the illuminated complex. "Counting on it," David replied, his face grim with determination. "These marshes are death to anyone who doesn't know them." "And you do?" "I've smuggled enough contraband through here to know the safe paths." He guided the transport along what appeared to be solid ground amid the bubbling pools of corrosive liquid. The terrain grew increasingly treacherous, with geysers of toxic gas erupting unpredictably from the marsh. The sounds of pursuit grew closer, the whine of hover engines and the thrum of atmospheric crafts. Searchlights swept over them, briefly illuminating their vehicle before David swerved behind a rock formation. "We can't outrun them forever," Zahira said, her voice tense but controlled. "No," David agreed, "but we can outthink them." He steered the transport into a narrow canyon where the walls were streaked with minerals deposits that glowed faintly in the darkness. The path ahead forked, one route leading deeper into the marshes, the other climbing toward higher ground. David took the path toward the marshes, then suddenly cut the engine and lights. "What are you doing?" Zahira hissed. "Trust me," he whispered back. They sat in darkness as the pursuit vehicles approached the fork. After a moment's hesitation, the searchers took the path toward higher ground, their lights disappearing around the bend. David waited another minute before restarting the transport, this time with only the running lights active. He guided it carefully along the marsh path, navigating by memory and instinct. "That won't fool them for long," Zahira observed. "Long enough," David said. "There's an old mining outpost about 2 clicks from here. We can take shelter, figure out our next move." They continued in tense silence, the only sounds the soft hum of the engine and the occasional bubbling of the marsh. The toxic air outside left rainbow-like smears on the transport's viewports. As they rounded a bend, the path ahead suddenly disappeared into a vast pool of roiling, acidic liquid. David slammed on the brakes, the transport skidding to a halt at the edge. "Damn," he muttered. "The marsh has shifted since I was last here." Behind them, they could hear the pursuit vehicles returning, having discovered the deception. "We're trapped," Zahira stated flatly. David scanned the surroundings frantically, looking for any escape route. There was none. The narrow path they had followed was the only solid ground, and now their pursuers were closing in from behind. "We have to abandon the transport," he decided, grabbing a breath mask from the emergency kit. "The marsh is shallower near the edges. If we're careful, we can make it around on foot." Zahira took the mask he offered, her eyes reflecting the eerie glow of the marsh. And if we're not careful, then we dissolve, David said grimly. But it's better than going back. They exited the transport, the acrid air immediately stinging their exposed skin. The breath masks filtered the worst of it, but their eyes watered and their skin prickled painfully. David led the way, testing each step before committing his weight. The ground was treacherous. What looked solid often gave way to bubbling pools of acid. The sound of pursuit grew louder. Searchlights swept the area, coming closer with each pass. "They're almost on us," Zahira warned, her voice muffled by the mask. David nodded, his eyes scanning the terrain ahead. A particularly wide pool blocked their path completely, with no visible way around. "We're cornered," he admitted, his voice tight with frustration. The searchlights found them, harsh white beams pinning them against the glowing marsh. Hover vehicles descended, surrounding them on the narrow strip of solid ground. Zahira whirled to face David, her amber eyes blazing behind her mask. "Why do you fight for me?" she demanded, her voice rising in a rare display of emotional intensity. David met her gaze unflinchingly. "Because they would have broken you," he said, his voice rough with conviction. "And you're the only one left who hasn't bowed to this damn galaxy." Something shifted in Zahira's expression. A softening, a recognition of something in this human that mirrored her own stubborn refusal to surrender. The security forces closed in, weapons trained on the fugitives. Their leader, a tall insectoid being in captain's insignia, stepped forward. "Surrender now," it chittered through a translator, "or we will open fire." David moved slightly, positioning himself between Zahira and the weapons. It was a small gesture, almost unconscious, but she noticed. "What's your plan now, human?" she murmured. "Working on it," he replied, his eyes never leaving the security forces. The captain grew impatient. "Last warning." David tensed, ready to make a final, desperate move, when the ground beneath the security forces suddenly gave way. The supposedly solid path collapsed, plunging 3 of the hover vehicles into the marsh. Their metal hulls immediately began to sizzle and smoke as the acid ate into them. The remaining forces scattered in confusion, their formation broken. "Run!" David shouted, grabbing Zahira's arm and pulling her along a narrow ridge that had appeared when the ground shifted. They sprinted across the unstable terrain, each step a gamble. Behind them, the security forces regrouped, but the marsh itself had become their ally, unpredictable and deadly. They had almost reached the far side when a stray bolt caught David in the back. He stumbled, fell to one knee, his breath coming in harsh gasps. "Go," he urged Zahira, pushing her ahead. "Get to the outpost." Instead, she turned and fired back at their pursuers with deadly accuracy, buying them precious seconds. Then she hauled David to his feet, supporting his weight. "Not without you," she said simply. Together, they staggered the final distance to more stable ground. The mining outpost was visible now, a dark silhouette against the night sky. But David was weakening, blood soaking through his jumpsuit. "Almost there," Zahira encouraged him, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. David nodded, his face pale and drawn with pain. Each step became a monumental effort, his body growing heavier as his strength ebbed. "They're coming," he managed to warn her, the words slurred. Zahira glanced back. The security forces had found a way around the collapsed section and were advancing again. With a grunt of effort, she lifted David over her shoulder in a rescue carry, his weight significant but manageable with her enhanced strength. She began to run, her powerful legs eating up the distance to the outpost. The path through the marshes grew increasingly treacherous, narrow strips of solid ground winding between bubbling pools of corrosive liquid. The toxic air burned her lungs despite the breath mask, and her legs ached with the strain of carrying David's unconscious form. A misstep sent her ankle-deep into a puddle of acid. She hissed in pain but kept moving, the synthetic material of her prison garment dissolving where the liquid touched it. The marshes stretched endlessly before her, and the lights of pursuit still flickered in the distance behind. "This is madness," she muttered to herself, adjusting David's weight. "Why am I risking my life for a human? For one of them?" But even as the thought formed, she knew the answer. This human was different. He had offered himself for her freedom, invoked the Thalkir, an ancient rite she had thought long forgotten in this mercenary galaxy. And more than that, he had been as much a victim of the Syndicate's manipulation as her people had been. Her foot slipped again on the treacherous ground and she nearly fell. Struggling to regain her balance with David's weight on her shoulder, She felt something inside her crack. Not a bone, but something deeper. A wall she had built around her emotions since the fall of Azarath. She lowered David carefully onto a relatively stable patch of ground, checking that his breath mask was secure. In the eerie glow of the marsh, his face was pale, his features slack with unconsciousness. Blood had soaked through the makeshift bandage she'd applied to his wound. "Don't die, human," she whispered, her voice tight. "Not after all this." To her horror, she felt moisture on her cheeks. Tears, something she hadn't allowed herself since watching her world burn. The realization only made them flow faster, silent sobs shaking her powerful frame as she knelt beside the injured man who had risked everything for a stranger. "Which ball?" she asked the unconscious form. "Why would you do this? Why would you make me care whether you live or die?" There was no answer but the bubbling of the acid marsh and the distant wail of pursuit sirens. Zahira wiped angrily at her tears with the back of her hand, leaving streaks of dirt and blood across her sapphire skin. "Enough," she told herself firmly. "Tears are for the dead. And you, David Rourke, are not going to die today." She lifted him again, renewed determination lending her strength. As she secured him over her shoulder, his eyelids fluttered briefly, unfocused eyes taking in her tear-streaked face before closing again. "I saw that," she muttered, resuming her punishing pace. "If you mention it later, I'll deny everything." The outpost was visible now, a dark silhouette against the night sky. Zahira fixed her eyes on it and pushed forward, each step a battle against exhaustion and the treacherous terrain. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter. The security forces evidently unwilling to risk the depths of the marshes at night. David's consciousness faded in and out, the world reduced to flashes of sensation. The jolting rhythm of Zahira's run, the sting of the toxic air, the warm wetness of his own blood, and something else, something he hadn't expected. The memory of a warrior's tears glinting in the phosphorescent light of the marshes. "Stay with me, human," Zahira's voice came to him as if from a great distance. "You don't get to die after all this trouble." David tried to respond, but darkness claimed him. He woke to the sound of voices, angry, insistent. With tremendous effort, he forced his eyes open. He was in a small, austere room with low ceilings and walls of rough-hewn stone. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and something earthy, like moss or lichen. A single light panel cast a soft glow over simple furnishings. He lay on a narrow cot, his torso wrapped in bandages that gleamed with medicinal gel. The voices came from beyond a heavy door made of some dark, dense material. One of them he recognized with a surge of relief was Zahira's. "I've invoked sanctuary," she was saying, her tone cold and commanding. "By your own laws, you must grant it." A deeper voice responded, weary and reluctant. "Sanctuary requires offering. You have nothing to give." "I have myself," Zahira replied. "My bounty is substantial, more than enough to cover both of us." "And why should we risk harboring two fugitives?" A third voice interjected, higher and more brittle than the others. "The syndicate doesn't recognize our neutrality. They'll raise this entire outpost." "Then kill us now and collect the bounty yourselves," Zahira challenged, her voice sharp as a blade. "Or honor your own code. Choose." There was a long silence, being broken only by the sound of shuffling feet and muffled whispers. David tried to sit up, but pain lanced through him, forcing a groan from his lips. The door immediately opened and Zahira entered, followed by two beings in simple gray robes. One was tall and gaunt, with pale, almost translucent skin and deeply set eyes that reflected light like polished metal. A member of the Order of the Balanced Path, a monastic sect that maintained neutrality in the endless conflicts of the sector. The other was shorter, stockier, with skin that seemed to shift colors subtly, like oil on water. A camelid, rare this far from the core systems. "She's worth more than me," David coughed, his throat dry and raw. "Don't let her—" "Shut up, Rourke," Zahira cut him off, moving to his side with surprising speed. "You talk too much." The tall monk watched them with eyes that had seen centuries of life. "The offering is accepted," it said finally, its voice resonating strangely in the small room. "Sanctuary is granted for 7 standard cycles. After that, you must leave." The camelid monk made a sound of disapproval but did not contradict its companion. "I will prepare healing compounds," it said reluctantly, its skin flushing a deep, frustrated purple before it left the room. Zahira nodded to the tall monk. "Thank you." The monk departed, closing the door quietly behind it. David struggled to focus on Zahira's face. "What did you do?" "What was necessary," she replied, checking his bandages with careful fingers. "The monks will heal you. Then we'll figure out our next move." "My ID," David began. "Is gone," Zahira finished for him. "We burned it, along with mine. The monks gave us new identifiers. Untraceable." David processed this information slowly, his mind still foggy from blood loss and pain medication. "You could have left," he said finally. "You could be halfway across the sector by now." Zahira's hands stilled on his bandages. "Yes," she agreed simply. "Why didn't you?" She was silent for a long moment, her amber eyes unreadable. Then she moved to the small window cut into the stone wall. Outside, the acid marshes glowed with an eerie bioluminescence, casting strange shadows across her face. "When my world fell," she said quietly, "I was leading an evacuation ship. Children, mostly. Future warriors of my clan." Her fingers touched the woven bracelet on her wrist. "We were captured by syndicate forces. The children were separated, sold to labor colonies. I was considered valuable, exotic. I've been passed from one collector to another ever since." She turned to face him, her expression carefully controlled. "In all that time, no one has ever risked themselves for me, or for any of my people. No one even tried." Her voice hardened slightly. "I don't take such debts lightly." "Not a debt," David managed, the words costing him effort. "Then what would you call it?" "A choice." Zahira tilted her head slightly, studying him as if he were a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. "You humans are strange creatures." "So you've said." She sat beside him on the edge of the cot, her posture rigid despite her obvious exhaustion. For the first time, David noticed the cuts and burns on her arms and face, injuries she'd sustained in their escape. "You need treatment too," he observed. "The Azure-born heal quickly," she dismissed. They fell into silence, but it was different now, not tense or wary, but companionable. The quiet of two people who had faced death together and found unexpected trust. "I remember," David said suddenly, his voice low. "In the marshes. You were crying." Zahira's body tensed, her eyes narrowing dangerously. "You were unconscious." "Not entirely." He met her gaze steadily. "Why?" For a moment he thought she might deny it, or perhaps strike him for his presumption. Instead, she sighed, a surprisingly human sound. "I don't know," she admitted, looking away. "Perhaps I was mourning what I've become, a fugitive carrying a dying human through a toxic wasteland. Perhaps I was mourning what I've lost. Or perhaps," she hesitated, "perhaps I was afraid you would die before I could understand why you did what you did." David reached out tentatively, his fingers brushing against the woven bracelet on her wrist. "I'm still trying to understand that myself." Days passed in the monastic outpost. David's wounds healed slowly under the monk's care, his strength returning gradually. Zahira remained by his side, not out of obligation but by choice, though she would never have admitted as much. They learned each other's stories in those quiet days. David spoke of his life as a Marine, his disillusionment with the military-industrial complex that had colonized world after world, his eventual desertion and life as a cargo hauler. Zahira told him of the Azure-born, their culture of honor and skilled combat, their tragic end as victims of genocide when they refused to become weapons for the galactic powers. "You're the last," David said one evening as they shared a simple meal. Zahira nodded, her face shadowed. "As far as I know." "How did you survive?" She was silent for a long moment. "I was off-world, training with the elite guard. When I returned." Her voice trailed off, the memory still too painful. David understood. It was the same pain he carried, the survivor's guilt, the rage at being the one left alive when everyone you loved was gone. "What will you do now?" he asked. Zahira shrugged, a human gesture she'd picked up from him. "Survive. It's what I do." "Alone?" She met his eyes. "I've always been alone." "Not anymore," David said quietly. Something flickered in her amber eyes, surprise perhaps, or the first tentative acceptance of a truth she'd been fighting. That somehow, against all odds, she had found an ally in this strange human who had bid his life for her freedom. On the 6th day, as the monastery prepared for the arrival of a supply ship, Zahira sat alone by the window of their shared quarters. David had finally managed to walk the length of the corridor without assistance and was being examined by the camelid healer. The monks had promised them passage on the supply ship the following day. False identities, a fresh start in the outer rim. She turned the metal bracelet on her wrist, watching as the embedded stones caught the light. It was the last remnant of her house, her lineage, warriors who had stood against the tide of colonization and paid with their existence. What was she now? The last ember of a dead fire, a curiosity to be hunted and displayed. In the distance, she could see the acid marshes, their deadly beauty a reflection of the galaxy itself, beautiful, lethal, indifferent to the small lives that struggled across its surface. She had been prepared to die there, had almost expected it. Instead, she was here, alive, because a human with nothing left to lose had decided her freedom was worth his life. "Why?" she whispered to the empty room. "Why didn't you leave me, like all the others?" The question had plagued her since their escape. It made no logical sense. There was no advantage for him, no clear benefit. Yet he had done it anyway. Even more confusing was her own decision to stay with him, to ensure his survival. She told herself it was a debt, a matter of honor. But in the quiet moments like this, she admitted the truth. Something had shifted between them in that holding cell, something she couldn't name but couldn't ignore. The sound of the door opening interrupted her thoughts. David entered, moving slowly but steadily. The color returned to his face. "Good news," he said with a tired smile. "The healer says I'll live." Zahira nodded, composing her features into their usual mask of calm detachment. "Good. I'd hate to have carried you all this way for nothing." David chuckled, then winced slightly as the movement pulled at his healing wounds. "The monks say the ship arrives tomorrow. We leave at dawn." "Where will we go?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "We, not you, not I, we." If David noticed the significance, he didn't show it. "The outer rim is safer, less syndicate presence. We can find work on one of the free stations." "As what? An ex-Marine and the last Azure born? We might as well paint targets on our backs." "As nobody," David corrected. "Just two more drifters looking for work. The monks are thorough with their new identities." Zahira turned back to the window. "I've spent my life being what others wanted. A warrior, a trophy, a slave. I don't know how to be nobody." David moved to stand beside her, looking out at the marshes. "Then be whoever you want to be. That's what freedom means." She glanced at him, this human who spoke of freedom as if it were a simple thing, a natural state rather than a precious, fragile condition that could be stripped away in an instant. "And you?" she asked. "Who will you be?" David was quiet for a moment. "Alive," he said finally. "That's enough for now." On the 7th day, as David was finally able to walk without assistance, Zahira entered their shared quarters with news. "The ship has arrived," she said. "We leave in an hour." David nodded, carefully testing his injured shoulder. "Good. The outer rim is safer for us both." Zahira watched him with an unreadable expression. "You should rest," she said finally. "The journey will be difficult." He smiled at her concern, still a new and fragile thing between them. "I've had worse days." "Yes," she agreed, a hint of a smile touching her lips. "You have." Before he could respond, she reached into a small pouch at her waist and withdrew something that glinted in the dim light. "The monks found this," she said, holding it out to him. "It was in your jumpsuit when they treated your wounds." David looked down at the object in her palm, his marine tags, the metal scored and tarnished from years of wear. The sight of them sent a complicated wave of emotions through him. Pride, shame, regret, resolve. "Thank you," he said, taking them carefully. "I thought they were lost." Zahira hesitated, then reached for her wrist. With deft fingers, she unfastened the woven metal bracelet, the last remnant of her house, her lineage, her lost world. She held it out to him. "Among my people," she said, her voice formal, "when one warrior saves another's life, they become blood-bonded. Clan." David looked at the bracelet, understanding the immense significance of what she was offering. "Zahira, I can't—" "You can," she interrupted. "You will, unless you wish to insult me." There was a challenge in her amber eyes, but something else too, vulnerability, hope. Slowly, reverently, David took the bracelet. It was surprisingly light, the metal warm from her skin. The embedded stones pulsed faintly, as if alive. How do I, he began. Zahira took it back and with the same careful movements, fastened it around his wrist. The metal seemed to adjust, conforming perfectly to his human anatomy. Now you are Kierzalin, she said simply, the last son of a dead house, but not forgotten. David looked down at the bracelet, then back at Zahira. Without a word, he removed his marine tags and placed the chain around her neck. And you're a Rork, he said, the last of another dead house. She touched the tags, her fingers tracing the stamped letters of his name. What does it mean? To be a Rork? David smiled, a genuine, unreserved expression that transformed his scarred face. It means you're too stubborn to die when you should, and too principled to live easy when you shouldn't. A soft laugh escaped her, the sound surprising them both. That night, as David drifted towards sleep, Zahira spoke from her cot across the small room. You lied, she muttered, her voice barely audible. About? David asked, turning to face her in the dimness. Being dangerous, she replied. You're the most dangerous fool I've met. He chuckled softly. How so? Zahira was silent for so long that David thought she might have fallen asleep. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. Because you make me believe there might be something worth fighting for besides survival. David absorbed her words, understanding the weight of them. How difficult they must have been for her to say. Name's David Rourke, by the way, he said lightly, offering her the gift of not dwelling on her vulnerability. I know, she replied, and he could hear the smile in her voice. I never forget those who bid everything. In the darkness of the monastic outpost, as a toxic storm raged outside and unknown futures waited beyond, two survivors, the last of their kinds in different ways, found something neither had expected. Not just an ally, but a reason to keep fighting in a galaxy that had taken everything else from them. He gave up his name and earned one that couldn't be taken.